Chapter 4 The Rich, Part 2. The red-orange light of sunset was filtering through the one window of the second floor when Twilight heard the sound of the front door opening below. She raised her head blearily from its place on Pinky's shoulder, ears twitching as the sound of conversation approached up the stairway. Sea Saber stepped into view, her eyes immediately darting to the veritable horde of books next to the table.
"Where did those books come from?"
Teo shrugged sheepishly as she came to a stop by Saber's side.
Twilight wanted to read up on some history, so I went out and borrowed some books from the library.
"The library?"
Saber slowly turned to face Trails.
"The same library that you borrowed that comic from 2 years ago?"
Trails blinked.
Yes?
There was a long moment where Saber didn't say anything, only narrowing her eyes as Trails shied away.
"You got her an ID and took her to the library, didn't you?"
Trails looked away, suddenly finding the pile of books to be very interesting.
I suppose you could say that, yeah?
Saber sighed, running a hoof through her mane.
"Did you at least manage to keep her gift hidden?"
Never mind.
"We'll talk later."
Saber turned, arching a brow at the pile of mares on the floor.
"Mr. Rich apologizes for any inconvenience. He'd like to extend an invitation to dine with him at his estate tonight."
Twilight straightened up, climbing to her hooves as her friend stirred around her. Rainbow Dash was the first to speak.
Invitation, huh? And what happens if we say no?
"Then you'll be free to go,"
Saber said.
"Mr. Rich is not in the business of keeping ponies against their will."
What is he in the business of exactly?
Twilight asked. Flint spoke up from his spot in the corner. "That ain't an easy question to answer, little mare." Saber nodded.
"He describes himself as a business pony, but all the business ponies I know say otherwise. Do you want to come or not?"
She glanced over to the pile of books.
"I would recommend that you do."
"And why's that?"
Applejack asked.
"Where else would you go?"
Saber asked.
"Out onto the street? You have no bits to pay for a room, and I doubt you want to take up labor in the factories or mines. There's a dozen ponies on every street corner waiting to con you. If nothing else, I can assure you that Mr. Rich has no malice in his mind, and he will help you understand what's happened to the world in your absence."
Twilight's mind lingered on that last sentence. It was true that she had no idea what they might do if they were set free, and ultimately, she'd probably end up seeking out a pony like Mr. Rich anyways. Sea Saber and her crew had treated them well so far, and as far as she could tell, hadn't lied about anything yet. If it was true that they were free to go, then she had nothing to lose from accepting the invitation.
I've already lost so much. I think we should go meet him,
Twilight said, turning back to her friends.
What?
Rainbow Dash exclaimed.
Twilight, this is the guy that's been holding us here.
Rarity raised a hoof delicately.
Saber did just say that we could leave whenever we wanted, darling, and it's not as if we were tossed into some grimy dungeon and locked behind bars.
She wrinkled her nose as she eyed the dirty fabric of the sofa behind her.
Though, it's hardly a Canterlot suite.
Twilight might be right, Rainbow,
Applejack said.
Where else are we gonna go, huh? This Mr. Rich fellow might even be able to help us out.
Rainbow tossed her hooves up in frustration, hovering a few inches off the floor.
I don't know. I'm just so tired of sitting around and doing nothing, and going to dinner with the guy that's been holding us prisoner doesn't sit right with me. He's also the guy that got us dug up in the first place,
Applejack said, stomping a hoof. Pinkie Pie stepped in front of Rainbow Dash, cutting her off.
He doesn't seem like a really bad pony, Dashy,
she said.
Why don't we become friends with him?
Rainbow snorted, tossing her mane.
Okay, fine, we can go. I guess everyone else doesn't mind being imprisoned in some stupid office for 2 days. Hey, Trail said, our office isn't stupid.
Saber smiled, giving a little nod.
Great. We'll leave now, then. Already?
Rarity asked, her eyes darting about.
Oh, but I haven't seen a mirror in days. I'm hardly proper. It's already sunset,
Saber said, turning for the stairs.
Dinner will be served shortly afterwards. Let's go.
She didn't bother to wait for any further response. Saber was already out of sight as the other ponies set about preparing to leave. Twilight and Trails packed a sizable pile of books into the bulging saddlebags that had been borrowed from the office's stores, and Applejack wasted no time in hefting the sleeping Fluttershy into her back once more. Rainbow's grumbles and Rarity's panicked titters fell on deaf ears as the mares were guided out of the building and a short ways down the street, where a lonely pier jutted out from a small patch of exposed rock between a pair of wooden buildings. Floating lazily at the end of the pier was a simple airship, little more than a balloon and a propeller attached to a small boat. Sunfeather was waiting patiently near the front, next to a large wooden wheel and a pair of levers that stuck out of the floor. They boarded quickly, with Saber releasing the rope from the pier before making a wing-assisted jump aboard. Sunfeather pushed a lever forwards with a wing, silently guiding the ship away from the mainland as the propeller spun up. Twilight stayed pointedly in the center of the deck, distracting herself from the thought of all the open air beneath her by watching the islands pass by. They traveled east, away from the setting sun and gaining in altitude. The mainland grew distant as they flew, with the islands passing by above and below, gradually growing smaller as they went further east. Twilight thought back to the map of Highton she had seen before, trying to keep track roughly of their position. The islands east of the mainland were as varied in architecture as they were in altitude. They seemed to be organized into loose groups, and Twilight saw thick ropes running between many neighboring islands with open gondolas ferrying ponies between the packed tenements of some islands to the smoke-clogged streets or busy markets of others. More than once, their ship turned to avoid columns of smoke rising up from the factories beneath them, and several other vessels of similarly sparse design crisscrossed their paths as they went. The sun was low on the horizon by the time they finally reached their destination, with much of its light blocked by the bulk of Highton beneath them. They pulled up to a small but sturdy pier at what looked like the easternmost island in Highton, and Twilight actually found herself somewhat short of breath from the thin air, her ears having popped multiple times during the ride. A bleached white tower dominated the center of the island, its thick stones reminiscent of some kind of medieval castle. 4 wide gravel paths extended out from its base, each one decorated with stone statues fashioned into abstract shapes that reminded Twilight of the spiraling magical diagrams of her youth. Smaller packed dirt walkways snaked between the paths, weaving between an array of colorful trees and bushes that filled the air with the heady scent of their flowers. Twilight took a deep breath, savoring the scent as she and her friend disembarked and followed Saber down the closest gravel path, which led directly to their pier. It was the first time since her arrival in Highton that the air had felt fresh, unmarred by the bitter taste or thick clog of smoke which seemed to linger over every part of the larger islands. Her ears flicked at the sound of songbirds in the depths of the garden, and she turned to see a pair of blank-flanked gardeners stretching up to trim at a tall passing bush with long shears. Rarity let out a soft gasp behind her.
Oh, heavens! What a divine estate!
Nah, I'm not impressed,
Rainbow said, hovering above the group.
My gardens are certainly something special, if nothing else,
Applejack said.
Does Mr. Rich live up in that tower?
Pinkie Pie asked.
It's really, really big. He must have some crazy fantabulous parties.
Trails looked back with a smirk.
Quite possibly the best parties in Highton,
she said. Pinkie sucked in a great big breath of air, and Twilight braced herself to parse an indecipherable assault of words, only to be saved by Sea Saber's voice.
It is his tower, although it's mostly for show, she said. He doesn't really go up there that often, except for his open parties. He normally likes to entertain guests downstairs.
Twilight cocked her head, looking back at the receding silhouette of the small ship they'd taken here.
He pays for all of this with salvage crews?
The only other ships she saw docked were all of the same Spartan, air taxi design that seemed to be used for getting around locally. There wasn't any sign of any other large, long-range roaming ships like the Argo that other salvage crews might use, and as far as she knew, the crew's little office hadn't had a single customer for the past 2 days. Flint let out a low chuckle from the back of the group. We're more of a hobby of his, actually. Saber nodded.
You can ask him about it yourself if you want. We just work for him.
They came at last to the ornate wooden door at the end of its path, its surface carved into swirling patterns and further decorated with the same flowering vines that crawled across the marble statues of rearing earth ponies. It opened of its own volition as they approached, sweeping inwards with startling silence. A smartly dressed unicorn mare was waiting for them in the expansive vaulted chamber that served as the tower's foyer. Twilight couldn't help but stare at the blank spot on her exposed flank as she bowed.
Welcome to the estate. Mr. Rich is waiting in his study,
the mare said.
Thank you, Aura,
Saber said, not breaking stride. She led the group across the room to a wide archway set into the base of the staircase, which curved up the walls. Beyond the arch was another curved stairway that similarly gradual slope, though this one sloped downwards. Gently flickering lanterns set high on the rounded walls illuminated the carpeted steps, as well as the sweepingly intricate murals painted onto each side. The murals seemed to tell a story, perhaps that of a popular legend, and Twilight studied them with wide eyes as they passed, in the hopes of learning more of the history she had missed. The beginning of the mural seemed to be the artist's interpretation of Equestria during Twilight's time, with wide plains and rolling hills, each side showing a stylized depiction of the Alicord sisters, watching lovingly over the cottages that dotted the countryside. The princesses were depicted as watchful goddesses, with their flowing manes each taking up the entire sky at one point, their manes flowing in gentle twirls across sunny day or starry night. Twilight's eyes especially lingered upon the warm gaze of Princess Celestia, her pale pink eyes full of a knowing kindness. They delved further down the stairway, and Twilight was forced to tear herself away from her old mentor as the mural changed. The equestrian countryside grew dark as heavy clouds rolled into view, carrying on their backs a trio of hazy, ethereal beasts with the tall, majestic bearing of horses, their flanks little more than wispy curls of gray smoke.
Wendigos.
Twilight recognized the creatures from the old hearth-swarming legend of Equestria's founding, despite a few noticeable differences. These Wendigos were dark and gray, with flashing yellow eyes that crackled with electricity, and each sported a pair of wide, sweeping wings that released torrents of water in their wake.
Does anyone still remember hearth-swarming?
A great wave of water passed over the Equestria in the mural, and left in its wake an image of the land drowning beneath torrential rains. The peaceful cottages of the countryside were half submerged amongst the waves, while ponies stood on their roofs or hovered above the waters, all of pony kind looking up to the skies. There, the two Alicorn princesses faced off against the three Wendigos, with powerful magic beams crisscrossing the wall. As Twilight followed Sea Saber further down the stairway, another wave of water washed over the land, smashing against a wall of swirling gold and blue magic. Princess Luna was nowhere to be seen in the penultimate frame of the mural, which showed only Celestia casting a beam of magic into a huge wave of water sprouting from the last remaining Wendigo's horn. The equestrian continent was now completely submerged, though the mural did show a single island floating alone above the waves. A small swarm of Pegasi seemed to be rushing between the island and the water beneath, rescuing what unflighted ponies they could find before bringing them to the safety of the island. A flash of radiant gold separated the last part of the mural from the rest. Now, both Celestia and the last Wendigo were gone, leaving only the floating island sandwiched between the thick storm clouds and the raging waters beneath. A small group of ponies, mostly Pegasi, huddled together on the landmass. They came to the bottom of the stairway, the wooden door framed on top by carved clouds. Painted waves sloshed against the lower part of the door, while a few islands floated gently above.
What is all this?
Twilight asked as Saber opened the door.
Is this history?
Saber shrugged, holding the door open.
More like a legend.
The underground part of Mr. Rich's estate was just as impressive as the gardens and tower above, and perhaps even more expansive. Twilight had been expecting cramped corridors and darkness, but clearly the network of chambers were constructed with appearance in mind before cost. Support beams were disguised as carefully carved decorations, and no expense had been spared on lighting every corner with sparkling gold or silver lamps or chandeliers. If it wasn't for the lack of windows or the recent descent, Twilight wouldn't have been able to tell that they were currently traversing the depths of an island. They passed more ponies here, mostly servants wearing strangely colorful assortments of bow ties and trim coats that were quick to step out of the way or offer little bows before carrying on with their business. Twilight saw Rarity curling her lip more than a few times at some of the more unusual color combinations, the white unicorn letting out little titters and gasps at the very worst. Finally, they arrived at their destination, a tall wooden double door flanked on either side by hanging red curtains and chipped old statues of the Alicord princesses. Each of the doors was decorated by a trio of golden trim money bags arranged in a tight triangle. Saber paused as she raised her hoof to knock, looking back to Twilight and her friends.
He can be a bit tactless sometimes, but he does not mean it. Try not to get offended.
Her knock was quickly answered by a stallion's voice, heavily muffled by the thick wood, but still clearly discernible.
Come in.
The doors gave way with an eerie silence as Saber pushed them open, the well-oiled hinges giving no complaint at the weight. Behind them was a wide semicircle of a room, with the curved wall made up of a series of rectangular window panes separated with thin red framing. The center of the room was dominated by two wide columns of brick, each housing a square fireplace framed in by carefully constructed arches. Tall bookshelves laden with a colorful variety of books covered the two flat walls besides the doorway, each volume thickly bound with golden trim. One side of the room had a raised wooden platform, currently vacant, except for a large phonograph that was playing a quiet orchestral tune which sounded vaguely familiar to Twilight. The remainder of the room was filled with a wild collection of mismatched furniture pieces. It was as if someone had gone out of their way to make sure that every item came from a different set, with smooth marble, intricately carved wood, gently curving glass, and even blocky stone, all fighting for dominance. A pair of stallions were seated around a gently curved marble table with a glass top in the middle of conversation. The first, a plain brown earth pony with a black mane slicked to one side, was quick to jump off of the rainbow of pillars slathered over the carved wooden sofa he'd been reclining on. He spread his hooves wide in welcome, beaming brightly at the new arrivals.
Ah, and these must be my latest finds. Welcome, welcome,
he said, beckoning to them eagerly.
Please sit wherever you'd like.
The second stallion, a unicorn, also stood, looking towards the newcomers with detached interest. I didn't know you were expecting visitors. The first stallion ignored the comment, making straight for Saber.
Everything went well? No issues at all?
Saber shook her head.
No, sir. Do you need anything else? That'll be fine, Saber. Keep your team here for now, though, all right?
Saber dipped her head.
Yes, sir.
She beckoned the Trails and Flint with a flick of her tail, and the three ponies promptly stepped aside, closing the door behind them. The stallion immediately rounded on Twilight and her friends, who had remained standing near the door while they took in the scene. Rainbow Dash, who had been hovering closest to him, let out a little yelp as he reached out and snatched her hoof into an eager shake.
Ah, you must be the fast one, and flying too. How impressive! I'm Mr. Rich, but please just call me crazy.
Rainbow blinked, the corner of her mouth twitching upwards.
I'm Rainbow.
Ah, and the two unicorns! Mr. Rich advanced on Twilight and Rarity, reaching a hoof up to tap the latter's horn experimentally.
Which one of you two has the... Or is it both of you? Did you have formal magic training in your youth?
Rarity stepped back at the touch, her eyes darting side to side as if the garish furniture was threatening to attack her.
Oh, well, Twilight is much better at it.
Mr. Rich had already turned to face Twilight directly.
So it's you, then? You're the one with the magical ability I've heard so much about?
Twilight flinched back at the intensity in his gaze. Those bright silver eyes reminded her all too much of her own expression as she flipped through the open cover of a fresh spell book, eager to uncover the secrets of their target. She wasn't sure if she wanted herself to be read quite so thoroughly.
I'm, nothing special, Mr. Rich. I only cast a few major cantrips.
She lied.
A good compromise. Stronger than your average unicorn, but not enough to be noteworthy.
Mr. Rich's eyes bored into her as he leaned in even closer.
Multiple spells? Oh, magnificent!
He looked over her to the door, raising his voice.
Aid!
Sir?
Twilight started, looking back to see a stiff-backed attendant mare standing in the open doorway. She hadn't even heard the hinges creak.
Send for Aura, he said. Tell her to arrange for a reveal dinner for tomorrow, and then a follow-up next week. The best of everything.
The attendant frowned.
We already have the ball tomorrow, sir.
Even better!
Crazy let loose with an excited laugh.
We shall make the reveal at the ball, then.
The mare dipped her head as she stepped backwards, the door drifting silently closed behind her. Twilight glanced over to Pinkie Pie and was happy to see the pink mare's ears perk up attentively.
Oh, are you throwing us a party?
She asked.
Can I help? Please let me help.
Mr. Rich gave Pinkie a little more than a passing glance, instead taking a few steps backward to address the group as a whole.
So then, guests from another time. I imagine you're quite hungry.
The unicorn stallion, who had been waiting alone by the marble table with faltering patience, cleared his throat loudly.
I wasn't expecting our visit to be interrupted by other guests, Crazy.
Mr. Rich froze for a second, and for a moment, Twilight thought that he had actually forgotten that the other stallion had even been there. He recovered quickly, however, giving a friendly beckon with his head as he started for the door.
Oh, don't worry about it, my friend. Come along and join us for dinner.
The double doors glided open at Mr. Rich's approach, and the other stallion followed along with a begrudging flick of his tail. Twilight exchanged a few glances with her friends, giving Applejack a sympathetic smile as the mare readjusted Fluttershy's weight on her back.
I suppose we'd better follow him,
she said. Rainbow fluffed her wings and snorted as she landed.
I'm getting real tired of all this following.
You and me both, Sugar Cube, Applejack huffed.
Just a little bit longer, dears,
Rarity said.
We can get some well-deserved rest and relaxation after we fill ourselves with the exquisite food that's surely waiting for us, and perhaps have some of our questions answered as well.
And he's throwing us a party,
Pinkie Pie added. Twilight couldn't help but smile at the pony's energy.
Let's go, girls. I think it's been too long since we had a good meal.
Together, they followed after Mr. Rich and his guest, Pinkie and Rarity making quiet conversation at the back of the group. As much as the concept of food excited her belly, it was the enticing lure of answers that truly tugged Twilight forwards. And even though she knew a good night's rest would be good for her, Twilight didn't think she'd be able to truly relax for a long time.